Mr. Chairman, thanks for letting me go a little bit over my time.
It's fine. It's fine, Mr. Ranking Member. I'm pretty lax here. We don't have a big crowd. So I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Grant, I'd like to pick up just where Ranking Member Tanadar left off with you there. You mentioned in your written testimony that Congress passed the Real ID modernization in 2020, but did not give TSA direction on what use cases should be a priority. So I'd like to hear a bit more about whether you believe Congress should give TSA a directive to prioritize the online identity use cases, or rather give a separate entity the authority to be prioritizing, like NIST, the authority to be prioritizing and the direction to prioritize these types of cases?
Thanks for the question. So I'd like to see NIST more involved. I also think one of the things that was interesting is when the original Real ID Act was passed in 2005, DHS in general was given direction to figure out the standards and the regulations. And it was led out of their policy office at the time. When the Modernization Act was passed in 2020, which essentially said a Real ID could either be a plastic card or it could be digital, the assumption was that the same team in DHS might lead it again, but then TSA was basically given the authority. Jurisdictionally, this becomes a bit of a tricky issue, but there is certainly, as I talk about the cybersecurity implications of digital identity writ large and the way that mobile driver's license could play a role in solving those problems, one of the thoughts has been that CISA could potentially play a role, but CISA does not seem to be engaged on this particular issue. I don't know that CISA would be ideal necessarily. I would personally prefer to see this at NIST, but even within the scope of DHS and the current legislation that we have, DHS has the ability to bring in a cybersecurity set of experts as opposed to just TSA with its more limited focus.
Mr. Grossman, I would like to go back to your testimony about MDLs. I believe you described that they could offer better security and better privacy for consumers if they're designed properly. I'd like to hear more from you about what are the elements of that proper design that could ensure the security and the privacy.
So there's a number of elements that are laid out both in the standard as well as the AMVA implementation guidelines, and a couple that I'll highlight for an example. One is to not track where it is being used. So when someone uses it and it's read, that is not what we call calling home, phoning home back to the state agency. State agency doesn't know where and how you're using it. Making sure the protocols and policies are in place is a key protection. Another key protection of the mobile driver's license is you as the holder can decide what elements of my information am I going to share with this individual. By contrast, right now, if you think about every time you use your driver's license or identity card, you're physically handing it over to that person who may only need to know you're older than 21. And yet you're giving them your name, your address, information about you, whether or not you're an organ donor, the list goes on and on and on. Whereas you only need to know, I am old enough to make this purchase. And so the ability for, as an individual, to say, I'm only going to give you what you need, nothing more and nothing less, is the opportunity to protect that information.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Grant, back to you. One of the things that you mentioned was attributing the lack of progress at DHS to their desire to wait on the International Standards Organization to develop standards. We've touched on CISA, NIST. Can you elaborate on the advantages of DHS not waiting for the International Standards Organization to finish their work, both in terms of immediately protecting millions of victims from identity theft, in addition to wanting to remain the world leader in the digital identification space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'll preface this by saying that I mentioned this in my written testimony. I used to work at NIST. I used to lead digital identity efforts there from 2011 to 2015. Generally speaking, the voluntary consensus-based standards process that we embrace, along with a lot of our peers across the globe, is the best way to go. Every now and then, we have a bit of a crisis where we need to move a little quicker. And that's where I can think of at least two situations over the last 20 years where the White House or Congress have turned to NIST and said, you've only got 9 months, 12 months, and you've got to act. The first was in 2004 when President Bush issued Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12 in response to the need to have stronger ID for government workers and contractors. That was a presidential directive. NIST produced FIPS Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS 201, within 9 months. The second was in the Obama administration when Congress deadlocked on cybersecurity legislation. And so they said, well, let's at least come up with a cybersecurity framework that can be voluntary, that not only government agencies, but also industry can start to use to manage cybersecurity risk. There was an executive order in February of 2013. A year later, because NIST only had a year, they rolled out the CSF. In fact, that's become the basis of an ISO standard today. I think we're at a moment right now with FinCEN's documented $212 billion in suspicious activity reports in 2021 tied to compromised identity. The GAO said between 100 and 135 billion in pandemic unemployment benefits lost to fraudsters, again, mostly organized criminals and hostile nation states. You add those numbers up, that's between 300 and 350 billion just in two sectors. Just in 1 year. We can't afford to wait, and I think this is why we're at a point where we should stop deferring to ISO and hoping that the voluntary standards process works, and instead we basically put NIST, and really, I think we need a broader whole of government effort to address what I really think is a crisis right now when it comes to identity-related cybercrime.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for waving me onto this. It really, we've been wrestling with this and, for some years now, and it's, we're forced to sort of